Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the podium Jason Riley.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jason Riley. I'm a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's event on the historical relationship between blacks and Jews. As many of you know, this alliance goes back more than a century. Both groups were discriminated against in education, in hiring, in housing, which led them to unite in the struggle for colorblind justice and individual rights. Henry Moskowitz, a Jewish immigrant from Romania, co-founded the NAACP in 1909. Julius Rosenwald, a son of immigrants from Germany, made a fortune running Sears Roebuck and then teamed up with Booker T. Washington to build thousands of schools for black children in the segregated South. Rosenwald's philanthropy financed a third of the litigation costs in Brown versus Board of Education, a case that was argued before the Supreme Court by Jack Greenberg, a Jewish attorney who would go on to succeed Thurgood Marshall as head of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund in the early 60s. Rabbi Abraham Herschel, a leading Jewish theologian, was a personal friend of Dr. King and marched with him in Selma, Alabama. Among the white students who joined efforts to promote black voter registration in the South in the 1960s, Jews were wildly overrepresented, and some gave their lives. Yet this relationship has also been turbulent at times. Dr. King and Roy Wilkins, the head of the NAACP in the 1950s and 60s, were vocal supporters of the Jewish state. But the subsequent rise of black nationalism and separatism led to prominent black figures such as Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael and Louis Farrakhan not only denouncing Israel, but also promoting anti-Semitism. After Israel was attacked by several Arab nations in 1967, Carmichael said that, quote, "the only good Zionist is a dead Zionist." And his organization published a newsletter that described Israel as an illegal state. When Dr. King was asked to respond to this, he reiterated his support for Israel. Peace for Israel means security, he said, and we must stand with all our might to protect its right to exist, its territorial integrity. I see Israel, and never mind saying it, as one of the great outposts of democracy in the world, said King, and a marvelous example of what can be done, how desert land almost can be transformed into an oasis of brotherhood and democracy. Peace for Israel means security, and that security must be a reality. Regarding black militants of his day, King said that they don't speak for most black people. Quote, "There are some who are color consumed, and they see a kind of mystique in being colored," he said. "And anything non-colored is condemned. We do not follow that course, and certainly most the organizations in the civil rights movement do not follow that course," he said. In 1968, when King made that statement, perhaps it was true. But by the early 1990s, polling would show that blacks were twice as likely as whites to hold anti-Semitic views. In 2005, a poll showed that 36% of blacks held strong anti-Semitic beliefs, which was 4 times the percentage of whites. Even within political categories, a racial gap has persisted. A 2020 survey found that 42% of black liberals and 15% of white liberals endorsed anti-Semitic stereotypes. So when you look at these polling trends, the black reaction to October 7th and its aftermath becomes much less surprising. But just because so many black activists and politicians and media elites responded in ways that we could have anticipated doesn't make it any less disturbing how they responded. Black people and other people who want to focus on white racism lose all moral credibility when they ignore or downplay black anti-Semitism. Moreover, not talking about it allows it to fester and to grow. And that's why we've gathered here today. We've assembled a thoughtful group of journalists, academics, lawmakers to discuss how we got to this point and where we go from here. We're going to start with a panel discussion on the history of the Black-Jewish alliance and why the 1960s became an inflection point. And that will be followed by a second panel discussion of the post-60s alliance, run up to October 7th, and the fallout from the campus unrest that followed the attack. And finally, we'll conclude with a one-on-one interview between Juan Williams and Congressman Richie Torres. So again, thank you for coming, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. So let me start by introducing our panelist. To my immediate right is Jamie Kirchick, a journalist and a book author. He's writer at large for the publication Air Mail and a contributing writer to Tablet, a magazine focused on Jewish news and culture. His writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic, among other publications, and is the author of two books, The End of Europe, Dictators, Demagogues, and the Coming Dark Age, and more recently, Secret City, The Hidden History of Gay Washington. Sitting to Jamie's right is the Reverend Herbert Brisbon, who serves as chaplain at Dillard University in New Orleans, and is director of Dillard's National Center for Black-Jewish Relations. He's also an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church and has been involved in several ministries, including Young Life Metro Atlanta, Young Life Urban Spartanburg in South Carolina, and Boyhood to Manhood. So welcome to both of you, and thanks for doing this. Reverend Brisbon, why don't you start by talking a little bit about the center at Dillard University, how it came into existence, and what it's attempting to do.
Well, our center, greetings to everyone. Our center initially was conceived out of the brain of Dr. Samuel Du Bois Cook, who was the fourth president of Dillard University. From 1974 to 1997, he was actually the president, but he spent a lot of time with Dr. King and even with Rabbi Herschel and some of the others. But he was always engaged in some type of engagement as it relates to social and community activism of some sort. And it was a brainchild of his in 1989 as it relates to how do we help to have some conversation around Black and Jewish engagement. And so through 1989 until the late 2000s, the center was actually active. After Katrina really shifted the focus of the school. And so under the leadership of Dr. Rochelle L. Ford in 2021, it was rebirth. And so we've been very active in trying to see how we can be intentional about creating conversations just in light of all that has been taking place. From the statements from some of our Black athletes to just simple engagement across the board. How do we foster healthy conversations? And that's been our major contribution to reinstating the center. We began with the Beloved series, where we invited persons to come and participate in a dinner. One of the things we're very clear of is that we all love good food. be it kosher or whatever. We love good food. And so the Beloved series began with a dinner where we invite everyone, no more than about 40 people, be it from the Jewish community, the Black community, the church community, the school community, and we come together and have some conversation around a hot topic. This year we kicked it off with Tree of Life from the synagogue there in Pittsburgh. And Tuesday night, we had a meal where we all sat at a table and just had some discussions where we could then in turn begin to find the commonalities. From that moved into the viewing of Tree of Life, where we all watched, and then after which we had discussions on Wednesday. And so that same programmatic pattern followed throughout the overall programmatic leading throughout the season, and we had a culminating showing of Mother Emanuel, where we invited the Jewish community and the AME churches to come together and the students, and we had conversations around how do we better support one another, because initially when you sit down and think about the struggle, especially for the Jewish community during the Holocaust, it was because of propaganda. When you look at what's happening within the Black community, it's still propaganda. And how do we then in turn best support one another or persons that are being oppressed because of propaganda and eliminating hate for what it is. So that's how that got started. And Dr. Du Bois had a lecture series that he put in place that was educating and informing the Black community and those persons that had an interest and an affinity for engagement.
Can you speak a little bit to how a Center for Black-Jewish Relations comes to be housed at a historically Black college going back further? I mean, you mentioned the Holocaust period. Was there a relationship that developed between HBCUs and Jewish immigrants back in that period that led to something like this?
Yes, one of the things you lifted up was like the Rosenwald. They are some of the major givers that helped Dillard in particular. I'm just gonna talk about my home, especially a lot of the HBCUs during the time of the Holocaust. Many of our professors, especially those from the Jewish background, sought refuge within the HBCUs, and they were able to then in turn find that solace that was needed as we continue to navigate those treacherous waters of the season. And many of our HBCUs, they were funded by Jewish philanthropists. And so there's a strong tie, but not only that, looking at some of our civil rights engagement, NAACP, strong ties with the Jewish community, because even in its formative days, one of the presidents was a Jewish brother. And so again, these are things that we hold, but how do we keep the history? As I love the way the Jewish community talk, who's telling the story? How we continue to lift up the story. And so that's part of our legacy, making sure we tell the story.
Sure. Jamie, I thought maybe you could start by talking about some of the conditions in the country that led to this alliance in the first place. Why would Jews and Blacks get together? What were their shared concerns? What were some of the conditions that led to this alliance?
Thank you, Jason, and thank you to the Manhattan. Is this on? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? No? Mr. Microphone? There you go. Okay.
There you go.
Thank you for having me,
Sure.
you and the Manhattan Institute, and great to be here on stage. This is a very important and neglected topic. And I think the Black-Jewish relationship in this country was a natural one because Jews came here. They were discriminated against. They were blocked from many institutions. And then worked together to overcome some of those differences. But I think here it's important to note, because I think that the experiences of both communities in this country were quite different, and I think explains part of the reason why tensions began. American Jews' patriotism is very uncomplicated because for thousands of years we were slaughtered and forced to convert and blamed for everything, and there were pogroms. I mean, it's just a veil of tears everywhere the Jews lived until we came to America. Now that's a very, I'm kind of putting a gloss on it because there was a lot of discrimination against Jews and whatnot. But most Jews growing up in America over the last 100 years considered this country to be the Goldene Medina, which means the golden land, right? Because as bad as anti-Semitism may have been in this country in the previous century, it was better than any other place the Jews have lived. And the Jews have fared better in America than any other immigrant group, I think it's fair to say. And so Jews are very, I think, they have a kind of almost simplistic patriotism about America. And I'm not criticizing that. I'm just sort of explaining what it is. And I think for African Americans, it's a much more complicated question, obviously, because African Americans did not come here by their own will, like Jews did, fleeing oppression. They were dragged here as slaves, and they were enslaved for 200 years, and then there was Jim Crow for another 100. And then there are still the vestiges of that legacy we see in many areas of life in terms of health, obviously health outcomes and education levels and certainly income levels. And so I think, American Jews have a very different perception of America and the American system than many not all African Americans, but many African Americans. And so I think that when you see the rise of these black nationalist groups in the late 60s and 70s, they have a very anti-American attitude. And in my opinion, I think anything that's anti-American is anti-Semitic, eventually. It's going to get there eventually. Because it's the same sort of conspiratorial hatred of liberal values, right? We're talking about hatred of small L liberal values. And those are the values that Jews have thrived under. Meritocracy, individual rights, religious pluralism. And so I think that past, is very important to recognize. Those two different experiences of this country, I think, are important to understand in trying to figure out, why did this relationship go awry, and why is it still a problem in many areas today?
Well, why is it still a problem is a good question. Of course, we can get to, but I want to ask both of you. Maybe we can start with you, Reverend. Has this relationship outlived its usefulness? I mean, Jamie talked about what led to it in the first place, but the big civil rights battles, voting, education, have been fought and won in this country. And how concerned should we be if there's some remaining tension between these groups? Jews and blacks stood shoulder to shoulder when it really counted, and turned out to be on the right side of history on these issues. And so why is this such a big deal? In other words, why is it any more of a big deal than tensions between any groups of any other race or nationality? I'll start with you.
I mean, when you sit down and look at history, the question is, has it have we really eradicated hatred? Have we really eradicated racism? We haven't. Mm-hmm. They're still here. Antisemitism is still here. And so again, how do we get together and begin to educate one another so that we can become stronger allies in one way or another? I think that's going to be key because, again, one of the things that we were very clear on, some of the things that were being said was being said out of ignorance because they didn't know. Again, how do we create space for conversation and educating one another? That's going to be paramount as we move forward. Because if you really sit down and think about even during the civil rights era, many of them were at each other's home and engaging or somewhere where we can have conversation. And again, that's one of the things that we really pride ourselves on there at Dillard is the theology of the table. The table, I don't care how tall or how short, I'm tall as I've ever known. So, again, it's only in comparison to when someone else is standing beside me that I realize I'm really not that tall, but I'm tall as I've ever known. But we can sit down and leverage the field and begin to engage in those conversations. So when you begin to look at history overall, as long as the pervasive elements of oppression is still present, we still need each other. Because there's not a utopia, but how do we advocate for the other? I think that's going to be essential, and that's just.
Well, I think part of the divergence in the 60s and 70s was that Jews were seen as becoming white, right? They went from being Jews, which were a distinct category, a minority category, and they became considered white, like Italians or Irish or even WASPs, perhaps. And that's just a very simplistic gloss on it. But I think to many of the anti-Semitic voices, or the voices that would become anti-Semitic in the black community, Jews were seen as sort of selling out by joining white people and betraying the black community or whatnot. And I think another important source of this divergence or anti-Semitism also around the same time, 60s and 70s, was that in urban areas, oftentimes the only white people that Black Americans would come into contact with, aside from the police, who are usually Irish, right, white ethnics, but the social workers, the teachers, the store shop owners, the landlords, people you don't generally like at all, right? But they were mostly Jews, at least in this city, and I think in others too. And so that's more of a kind of, you could call it maybe petty anti-Semitism. It's the kind of bigotry that arises between any two ethnic groups that are kind of, put in close quarters, and one has more power than the other. But, and then there's the more kind of conspiratorial anti-Semitism that we see with the Black Panthers, and then Farrakhan, and frankly, the kind of, the more intellectual anti-Semitism that's coming out of the universities. Yeah. And this is another divergence too, which is, I think, racial preferences. These were, this came about in the 70s, in the 80s, and this is a major fundamental clash, I think, even today, between blacks and Jews, is that Jews really thrived under a meritocracy. And to introduce another factor into into the admissions process or jobs and whatnot, at least in the 70s and the 80s, the Jewish organizations opposed racial preferences. They would change. Where to today, most of the Jewish organizations are sort of, democratically aligned, and they all condemned the Supreme Court decision last summer. But I think many individual Jews have long opposed racial preferences, and that's something. By the way, a majority of blacks oppose racial preferences, but the African American organizations, the African American elites, intellectual class is very strongly supportive of them, and I think that's another area of resentment that has grown over the past couple decades.
So Jamie's getting at something here, which is a divergence between a sort of rank and file anti-Semitism and the leadership. And if you go back to that 50s, 60s era, Dr. King's era, what you saw was a black leadership that was much more simpatico with the Jewish leadership at the time, even if you had the situation in neighborhoods with Jewish shopkeepers and so forth, and you had tensions there. At the leadership level, there was an effort to look past that and look at the common goals that you shared in terms of advancing society. Could you talk a little bit about how that attitude among black leaders changed? Your sort of King and Bayard Rustin and Roy Wilkins and the NAACP's leadership, their approach to this relationship, and how it morphed into what you get out of the Black Panther movement, the Stokely Carmichaels, the Louis Farrakhan's, on down today to Black Lives Matter and so forth. What's going on there, and what happened in that leadership?
When you sit down and look at that leadership, a lot of it, they turned inward and not outward. And what I mean by that, they were very clear about preserving their own by any means necessary. And so again, those relationships that had been fostered were now being severed. And so when it comes back to engaging, again, it takes every avenue in order to move it forward. Everybody can't be Malcolm. Everybody can't be Martin at the end of the day, but how do we be human and come to the table and engage in hearty conversations? And so I think that's just me personally, thinking that was some of what went on doing that, because everything was needed. Again, coming from my Christian background, it said all things work together. That's easy to put out there, but at the end of the day, each lens provided a different perspective that challenged or brought about a ruffling of the feathers that helped to advocate in some form or fashion for humanity as they saw it through their lens. And I had to respect that's how they saw it through their lens. But the question is, how do we get to places where we can communicate with clarity so that I can understand by which lens you're looking through?
Okay. Do you want to add anything to that, or?
I think in dealing with this problem, we see a lot of kind of white liberal paternalism toward the black community. Okay. So when we see these eruptions of anti-Semitic speech from the likes of Louis Farrakhan or Al Sharpton back before he was an MSNBC host, this is all sort of, you don't see, like, white liberals don't want to talk about it.
Right.
They don't want to condemn this in the way that they would condemn David Duke, even though Louis Farrakhan, I would argue, is a much more influential anti-Semite than David Duke. David Duke does not have a movement. He doesn't have 10,000 people coming to his mosque every weekend, right? So can someone please turn off their phone? Thank you. And so I think there's a white liberal paternalism that allows this to fester. And I could consider that a form of racism, because it's basically saying, you know what, we can't expect that much from black people.
You wrote back in 2018, I believe, a very good piece in Commentary magazine, saying that at that point in 2018, so this is pre-Black Lives Matter, pre-George Floyd, obviously pre-October 7th, that you thought black-Jewish relations were at their worst point since the early 1990s. What led you to that conclusion? What events are we talking about there? Because I believe a lot of it had to do with what was going on in the city over those decades that you're discussing.
From the 90s to 2018? Yes. I pointed out some incidents. There was a black member of the DC City Council where I live who it snowed heavily one day, and he went on Facebook and said that this was the work of the Rothschilds. There was Tamika Mallory, a leader of the Women's March. The Women's March was a big part of this. Several of the women there, I think 3 of them were African Americans, and they had close relationships with Louis Farrakhan. And it led to a huge rift within the Women's March, because there were Jewish women in the Women's March who wanted these black women to distance themselves from Farrakhan, and they refused to do that. And it actually led to we don't hear about the Women's March anymore. It basically destroyed that organization from within. And then there were the polls that I was reading that the ADL does every year, and you cited some of them. But so much has happened since 2018. Very little of it good in terms of this relationship. I mean, look, BLM was before that. BLM was founded, I believe, in 2013. Ferguson, maybe.
Trayvon.
Or Trayvon, 2012.
Is
and in the BLM charter, it's anti-Zionist. Why? Why is that part of the BLM charter?
Well, you mentioned the white guilt there, because you're right, it's in that charter.
It was overlooked. No one wanted to talk about it.
No one wanted to talk about it. I mean, including some people at the ADL.
Of course.
Who were dismissing these as a few bad apples, when in fact this had been written down ahead of time, that comparing, accusing Israel of genocide.
This is another part of it too, is that so many people in the Jewish community are so afraid to talk about this. They're so afraid to say, you know what, this is wrong. We don't like this. It's bad. Stop saying these things. It's hateful. And that, I think, just encourages more of it, right? If you're not honest in saying these things, then you're just going to get more of it, and that's what we've seen over the past couple of years.
Do you agree with Jamie that there is a reluctance? He's talking about among Jews to discuss black anti-Semitism, but what about among black leaders to discuss black anti-Semitism? I mean, I cited an example in my remarks of Dr. King pushing back at Stokely Carmichael and the black militants at the time. Is there enough of that going on today, you think, or is this a problem with the black leadership reluctant to sort of air the so-called dirty laundry in public and talk about this? And I ask that in the context of, I think in the early 90s, you did have a black leadership, an intellectual leadership, I should say, that was more willing to take on some of this.
Julian Bond and John
Not only Julian Bond, if you go back and read, you recall Farrakhan putting out that track on the secret relationship.
Henry Louis Gates.
Henry Louis Gates denounces this. Cornel West denounces this. They do so in the pages of the New Yorker magazine and the New York Times. I don't see that equivalent of that today going on. And I'm wondering if you've noticed something similar with the reluctance of black leaders in responsible positions to take on this black anti-Semitism.
And that is a big wrestle within our community because it's a big split because you have those that are in favor of Palestine, those that are in favor of Israel. And so when you look at a lot of the up and current leaders, many of them are in favor of Palestine. So again, when it comes back to understanding what's going on, who's telling the story, and what they're seeing many times is more of just, I hate saying it, micro snippets. And I mean, I'm just thinking about some of the students or even some of the leaders that I'm dealing with now. Many of them want to know, how do I get adequate information in order to better be informed? And so it's just a matter of how do we get the information, which I understand you can Google, you can find anything. But again, getting to a place where they can really sit down and wrestle with this so that they can come to some sense of conclusion and having some clear definitions of what is this whole anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic language. How do we foster that? Because one of the things that we do with some of the clergy is that we have small groups where we meet with some of the rabbis and clergy persons where we can have conversation and begin to dissect what is and what's not, and have some clear definitions that we will establish as some healthy boundaries of healthy conversations, so that we can be informed. And I think that's some of what's going on, because many of them are really either using media as their source of income, information, versus going out and doing some serious research to understand the history between the two communities. And so that's posing a serious fracture.
Do you think that social media has played a role in growing, not just among blacks, but in general? Is it easier for anti-Semites or people sympathetic to those views to get their message out and spread it? Is that exacerbated the situation?
I'm generally skeptical of the role of social media, only because you can put out good messages on social media more in a much more efficient way than you used to as well. I think it's something deeper, and we haven't mentioned this yet, but I really do believe this rise of whatever you want to call it, wokeness, contributes a huge part of it. It's the racialization of everything. It's calling Jews white, making a big point of calling Jews white. And since whites are bad in this new racial hierarchy, Jews are especially bad, because as I said earlier, not only are Jews white, they used to be not white, and they decided to take the filthy lucre and become white, and so there's more resentment against Jews than others.
Question.
Yeah. Also the racialization of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah.
The Palestinians are the people of color.
Yeah.
Israel is the white country. And just put aside how just factually wrong that is, that if you were to go to Israel, you wouldn't be able to tell many Israelis from Palestinians because they have different skin complexions. I mean, many Israelis could pass for Palestinian and vice versa. It's that frame that has been imposed on this conflict very successfully by, I think, like Bill Maher says, the font of everything crazy and wrong in this country, academia, has indoctrinated a generation of students into this belief system, and they now view everything through oppressor, oppressed, people of color, virtuous people of color versus evil white people, and I think that has a lot to do with this, and that's coming from some prominent. I blame Ibram X. Kendi for a lot of this, and his disciples and his many, many, many imitators in the American Academy.
Did you want to add something, Robert?
Well, I was just going to lift up one of the things that has really helped. I'm going to just talk about my microcosm, my world, is helping students to understand that Jews are very just as diverse as African Americans, and again, bringing that to an awareness. But it required us to have conversations, because one of the things that we've been very vigilant is that we have some Moroccan, I shouldn't say some, because that's like you just some black man, but we have a couple of Moroccan Jews that are present, that are showing us that it's just not a white face, that it's very diverse in that manner, and engaging within our community. Again, it's about creating that space for conversation. And when we're talking about, I think the title of the session is the shared legacy, and that commonality is so important. When you sit down and think about what's going on today, how many of us are actually sitting down and having real conversations with black or white or brown, Jewish or black or white Americans to have this real brave conversation to say, how can we advocate for one another and eradicate what's going on, the injustices within our communities? Because when you sit down and think about what's going on in the North, especially in DC, New York, you have a stronger population of Jews. But when you move into some of the rural areas, I didn't see a Jew until I got to college because of where I'm from. That was not a reality for me. I've read about it in the Bible, I've read about it in books, but when it comes down to it, because one of the other pieces we had to talk about in the Black community is how we demonize Judaism as being the one that kills our Christ. You know, so these are things that we have to really begin to say, is this healthy? How do we begin to navigate these pieces? And again, the only way that that's going to be able to come to fulfillment is by having healthy conversations and not allowing it just to be over here, but let's create brave space where we can sit down and really address some myths, some fallacies, some misnomers that have been put out there. And that's going to be paramount to moving forward. Because right now, we are all in our own little silos and we'll come together whenever we feel offended. But what happens when you think about what happened, transpired in Baltimore with Freddie Gray, we can go on down the list. If the other advocated for the injustices that had taken place for the other, imagine where we would be right now. Because it's not the same. And one of the things you alluded to earlier is the different oppositions around slavery for blacks and how the Jews came over. We understand all of that, but at the end of the day, oppression is oppression, hatred is hatred, and how do we then in turn advocate for the other, making sure that we cover each other in love in that capacity?
Yeah. You mentioned Ibram X. Kendi as one of the voices out there. I see something of a parallel, and I wonder if you share this view with the black leaders who sort of played the role of the stooge under Stalin in Russia. People like
Paul
Robeson, W.E.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes traveled over there and then came back and spoke to the American media, singing the praises of communism and comparing what life would be like for blacks versus the segregation and racism that they faced here at home. And I see you hear Nicole Hannah-Jones, the New York Times writer, talking about Cuba and what an equal society they've produced down there. You have Ta-Nehisi Coates traveling over to the Palestinian territories, coming back and giving interviews about Jews and genocide and likening the Palestinians to blacks under Jim Crow. Is this history repeating itself?
The valorization of Angela Davis today, I find incredible. Okay? This woman is a communist. She's a Stalinist. She received the Lenin Peace Prize in East Berlin. She endorsed the the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia, this woman. And she gets fawning coverage in the media. She's a scoundrel. Or the Black Panthers, criminal gang of murderers and rapists. Okay, we're now, but they had the food program, right? And there's these fawning, there's just a movie out now about Huey Newton, which is, this was a man who murdered a 17-year-old prostitute, okay? And it's making him the hero of a miniseries. And I just say, this is not good in general, but I think it's bad for black people. I think it's really bad for black people to hold these guys up as role models. And I don't want to sound patronizing, and it's not for me to tell the black community whom they should be holding up. But there's such a long, rich history of black leaders and artists and performers that I think are being unfairly neglected. Why don't we know more about Bayard Rustin, who's a personal hero of mine, and I think one of the great figures of the 20th century, and a leader and a model, I think, in terms of black-Jewish relations. Why don't we hear more about him? Why don't there's all these great black leaders, but they're not getting attention from our culture, from black intellectuals.
Bayard Rustin and King and that generation, believed in colorblindness, which is a dirty word today.
Yes,
I mean that's where we are, and I think you spoke about some of the just the ignorance in the black community regarding Judaism and Jewish people and Jewish history. Based largely on not having any interaction with actual Jewish people. And I do think there is something to that. And I think one of the dangers is that blacks can be much more easily manipulated into turning Jews into villains and blaming Jewish people for problems in the black community, which is a very old trope, but it's something that if you're very ignorant about this situation and this history, you're very susceptible to that. And I think that's why you see some of the sort of casual anti-Semitism in the black community. And the problem there, of course, is that to the extent that you are trying to demonize one group for your problems, you're not focusing on the real source of your problems. And so it becomes a distraction in addition to whatever else it is. But I think there's something to that. We've got a few more minutes before we turn things over to questions, and the second panel is going to get more into October 7th and the aftermath and the campus situation. But I did want to get some of your views on that. I'll start with you, Reverend. In 1957, President Eisenhower sent federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, to make sure that black students could attend school safely. Were Jewish students in 2024, should they have been treated the same way? Should the government have taken an active role, as Eisenhower did, in making sure that Jewish students on campus could attend school safely? Because kids are fleeing campus. Classes were canceled or held remotely because these kids were not safe on campus in 2024. And I wonder how we got from protecting black students on campus in 1957 to leaving Jews to fend for themselves on campus in 2024.
As I talked with some of my colleagues and some of my friends I was just in Brandeis for an event, and we were talking about, this is one of the major discussions. And one of the things that I conclude, any child life that is being threatened needs protection. As an educator, that's my responsibility to make sure that any child whose life is being threatened is to be protected. And so as an educator, we have a responsibility to those that have been entrusted into our care. And one of the things that I would say, it doesn't matter if it was 1957 or 2024, if a child's life is being threatened, I have a responsibility to make sure that that child is safe and protected. Now, that may not be the consensus of everyone else, but as for me and our community, that's one of the things that we were very clear of. And to the place that our campus became, we opened our campus up to those persons that needed a place to feel safe. And so when we sit down and think about what's going on, again, it requires all of us to advocate for justice and deal with the hatred, the poison that's being spewed out, and acknowledge it for what it is and call it out. And how then do we then move forward and not be afraid to say, this is wrong?
Yeah. Did you want to add anything to that, or?
Not to that particular question. No.
Okay. Well, one of the things you mentioned earlier, Jamie, was the role of affirmative action in the split that we saw in the late 1960s, and I think that's a very, very important point because this was an example of not just black nationalists or black separatists wanting to go in a new direction. When it comes to the push for special treatment for blacks, that's now become the goal of the mainstream civil rights movement. Yeah. After the 1965 Voting Rights Act is passed, you see a shift in the attitudes among the black leadership away from merely equal treatment towards electing black officials and pressuring government for special treatment for blacks, quotas, set-asides, and so forth. And there were many, many Jewish allies who said, we cannot go there with you. And I think that is something that has resonated for decades. And again, I think it's important because this is not something that can be blamed on the Black Panthers.
Yeah.
This was a shift that took place within the National Urban League, the NAACP, and the mainstream civil rights leadership, and I think it was for the worse.
Well, just look at the word quota. which has two meanings for Jews and blacks. The quotas that the Jews were trying to overcome were quotas on their ceiling of how many Jews could attend a school. It was discriminating against Jews. The quotas that the civil rights establishment began to favor around the same time was at the floor. It was to discriminate in favor of a certain group of people. So that word, I think, means different things to both communities, and it highlights this divergence.
Okay. Before we turn things over for questions, just one final question to both of you, and that's where you see things going forward. Have we hit a bottom here? Have we hit the floor? Do you see things getting better, or do you see things getting worse before they get better? Any thoughts on that? I'll ask both of you.
Me first?
Honestly, I am very scared because people are now clamming up and they're fearful of having conversations. And that's what's so disheartening for me. When I think about King, when he wrote the letter from Birmingham jail, and he was coming at those preachers or religious individuals, and because you can see what needs to be done, but many times you rather just clam up and just turn a blind eye. And that's what I'm afraid of, is that many of us are turning a blind eye. You can see the injustice of how one color is being treated or another race is being treated, but yet you still turning a blind eye. And because you're afraid that what you're going to say is going to offend someone. So that's where I'm really wrestling with right now. And even with my students, we had some students that had on, they were in support of Palestine, and we had some students that were in favor of Israel. And so again, how do you create space where they can then in turn come and have conversation?
I'd have to say, Jamie, I think I share the Reverend's pessimism here, partly because of the rise in prominence of the progressive left right now, which still seems ascendant in this country. The people who want to paint this in pictures of black and white, the oppressed and unoppressed, the diversity, equity, and inclusion crowd, the woke crowd, they seem to be ascendant, particularly in one of our major political parties. And I think that's going to be a problem to healing these divisions, at least in the short run.
Unfortunately, I agree with you, and I think I speak for many American Jews when I say that after October 7th, one of the most painful things, among many, many painful things, was the prominence of so many African Americans among the anti-Semites. I mean, just looking at the composition of the crowds of students at these campus pro-Hamas rallies and seeing a wildly disproportionate number of people of color in them. And I think this is much more painful than Charlottesville, right? Charlottesville, it's a bunch of schmucks in khakis, KKK, whatever. We're used to that. But I don't think I'm being hyperbolic when I say that every day since October 7th, there have been multiple Charlottesvilles for American Jews in this country, in some form or another, whether it's on campuses, whether it's online, whether it's in the literary world, which I just wrote about for the New York Times a couple of weeks ago. There's been these explosions of blatant anti-Semitism. And if I think that if there's a way for there to be hope here, I would say I think a lot of Jews who may have not felt this way before October 7th, they feel alone. They feel that the world does not understand them, what it means to be a Jew. And I think that is something that many black people have felt in this country over hundreds of years, that people who aren't black don't know what it's like to be a black person. They can't. We can try to empathize, right? And that's a shared feeling. Maybe there's some ground to appeal to each other on that level. Okay. I don't know. Okay. Trying to be optimistic.
We have a few minutes for questions. If anyone would like to engage, in the back there.
In November and December of 2019 and January of 2020, we saw a lot of hate crimes specifically in the Brooklyn area towards the Hasidic community. I believe Barry Weiss led a march of sorts then when things got really bad. So in the summer of 2020, when BLM movements were going on around the country and the rallies around the country, I was expecting a lot more of that type of attack, a lot of anger towards the Hasidic community as well. And that didn't happen. I'm wondering if you would have any insight for what might have changed from November, December of 2019 to the summer of 2020, and if there's anything we could learn from that for a more positive future.
Why the BLM protests in 2020, you're saying, were not anti-Semitic? Is that what you're asking? Why was that? Or, well, I mean, I think the anger that was being directed at that point in time was being directed at police, primarily, not at Jews. But I do think over the long term, it exacerbated the tensions within this relationship because BLM gained more power and more prestige, never having cut their anti-Zionism from their charter. It sort of led to this woke revolution that began in the summer of 2020, which has had bad consequences for Jews, I would argue, and for everyone, frankly. So I don't know. I'm not as rosy. I don't have as rosy of a memory as you do of that moment.